Welcome to this short paper video. In this paper we investigate the impact of multiple parallel phrase suggestions in a user study in the context of writing emails with such a suggestion system, and we compare native and non-native English writers in the use of this system with different UI parameters. We created a text editor prototype that uses a neural language model to generate text suggestions while the user is typing an email. As you can see here, it is possible to select suggestions with the mouse, but we also supported keyboard-based selection with tab, arrow keys and enter. Suggestions had a length of up to 4 words, and in this example we display 6 suggestions at a time. We compared different numbers of suggestions. As you can see here, we compared having no suggestions and 1, 3 and 6 suggestions. We also looked at language proficiency, comparing native English speakers to non-native English speakers. For our user study, we recruited 156 participants using the online platform Prolific. We asked them to write 4 emails each, and for these writing tasks we used 4 scenarios, which were fully counterbalanced in both order and combination with the 4 suggestion conditions. So let's take a look at the results. We found that showing more parallel suggestions increases their acceptance rate, more so for non-native than native speakers. Moreover, showing more suggestions leads to fewer cases where users modified a suggestion after accepting it. Showing more than one suggestion also increased the number of suggestion words in the final emails. Non-native speakers overall included more suggestion words than the native speakers. And as can be expected, showing more suggestions increased the time it took people to make their selection among these lists. Looking at time, showing 6 suggestions resulted in longer task times compared to no suggestions and 1 suggestion. And finally, the email length was rather stable across the different suggestion numbers. We also looked at patterns of engagement with suggestions based on a hidden Markov model analysis. And we found varying levels of engagement with suggestions, varying both within and between users. For instance, on the one hand, we have focus typing, manual typing without checking suggestions, without using suggestions. Then we have intermittent use of suggestions, where people combine their own typing with some suggestions in between. And on the other hand, we have chaining suggestions where people combine multiple suggestions in a row. This analysis further revealed impact of suggestions and different suggestion numbers on actions. So in general, we found these 3 types of actions relating to text production, navigation, and revision, and different numbers of suggestions impact on these actions and their frequencies. For instance, if we show more suggestions, this generally leads to more actions being spent on navigation, for example, navigating the list of suggestions. In a bit more detail and as a visual summary of the behavior of the participants in the study, here we have this visual overview of 9 fundamental behavior patterns that we found in our analysis. On the x-axis, we go from left to right, from low to high engagement with suggestions, as explained earlier. And on the y-axis, we have the 3 different aspects of production, revision, and navigation. So for production, we found focus typing, users typing manually without suggestion. Then we found typing and checking suggestions, not using them necessarily. And then we found using suggestions, and also in the more extreme case, a more dense use of suggestions, or even chaining multiple suggestions. Then for revision, one pattern that showed up without involving suggestions is deletion of chunks. So repeated presses of the backspace key or holding the backspace key pressed to delete, for example, the last sentence or even more. And then we found revision, so repeated backspacing or deletion and retyping. And then there's this interesting pattern where revision happens with suggestion. So the user is deleting something and then replacing it with a suggestion that then comes up. And for navigation, we have basically two kinds of navigation actions that also showed in these patterns. So you can navigate the text by moving the caret, for example, left to right with the arrow keys. And also for suggestions, once you are on the suggestion list, you can navigate those suggestion lists again with the arrow keys, for example. Okay, so here's a summary of the benefits of multiple suggestions that we found. So overall, multiple suggestions support writers in finding useful phrases. And the evidence for that from our study is that we observed that showing more suggestions increases the chance of accepting one of them. Showing more suggestions also reduces the need for users to manually modify the suggested text after accepting it. And finally, giving users a choice of suggestions, so showing more than one suggestion, increases the use of suggested text in the email overall. Similarly, we can look at the costs of multiple suggestions. And here we found that suggestions cost time and actions. So users take longer to choose from more suggestions. And in particular, with the condition with 6 parallel suggestions, people will take longer to write the emails overall. Suggestions also change the user's actions in the UI. For example, if we show more suggestions, that partly shifts user actions away from typing in favor of navigation of these suggestion lists. Beyond the costs and benefits of multiple suggestions, we also looked into the role of language proficiency, and here the summary is that this matters. So in particular, non-native speakers accept more suggestions and gain relatively more from seeing more suggestions in parallel compared to native speakers. And the time spent with multiple suggestions is less of an overhead for non-native speakers compared to the native speakers. Finally, non-native speakers perceive suggestions as slightly more positive and influential regarding the wording, content, and inspiration for using other phrases and words. As a conclusion and takeaways, our findings particularly motivate these 3 things. So first, we may explore a larger variety of UI parameters than considered previously with regard to the suggestion UIs. So for example, we could try to move beyond suggesting just one phrase or 3 single words, which is the current default in many such systems. Second, we could explore design goals beyond efficiency. So use suggestions not just to save keystrokes or time, but for example to also support ideation or language learning. And third and finally, we may consider user groups and specific user groups and their needs and preferences in this context more explicitly, as motivated in this particular case for user groups with different language proficiencies. And very concretely, recently language models have been in news for various undesirable biases in the generated text. In this context, our results highlight that bias can potentially hide not only in the model, but also in the way we design the UI. So for example, if we optimize AI writing tools for efficiency, we might not act in the best interest of, for example, non-native speakers. Yeah, and that brings me to my last point here, which is that text interaction is more than text entry. So we found these 9 fundamental behavior patterns that I've shown earlier, and they related to text input, but also to navigation, revision, and suggestion use. And beyond our focus on the suggestions here, these motivate other research in the future on supporting text interactions beyond text entry. In particular, we think it's promising to look at revision activities. So for example, we could ask the question how we might support users with AI language model capabilities, not just to produce text, but also to revise text.